সকলকে আবারও আমন্ত্রণ ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন ক্রিমিনাল ল এর প্রায় 25 বছরের এক্সপেরিয়েন্সড ব্যারিস্টার আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্টি। আপনার যেই কেস নিয়ে আমরা বলতেছিলাম যে যারা ফ্রড করেছিল, অনেক ব্যক্তি তারা কনস্পিরেসি করেছিল সমস্ত গভর্নমেন্ট প্রতিষ্ঠান, হসপিটাল, ইউনিভার্সিটির এগেইনস্টে প্রায় 12 মিলিয়ন পাউন্ডের মতো ফ্রড তারা করেছিল। ওখান থেকে দুইজনকে অলরেডি been jailed for a total of 11 years at Sadar Crown Court in September 2015. September 2015 দুজনকে সাদার ক্রাউন কোর্টে আপনার 11 ইয়ার্স 11 বছরের সেন্টেন্স দিয়েছিল ফর মানি লন্ডারিং, মানে অর্থ পাচার যেটাকে বলা হয়, মানি লন্ডারিং অর্থ পাচারের জন্য, এবং অ্যাকুয়ারিং ক্রিমিনাল প্রপার্টি, যে অর্জন করা একটা ক্রিমিনাল অ্যাকশনের প্রপার্টি, ক্রিমিনাল অ্যাক্টিভিটির প্রপার্টি অর্জন করার জন্য তাদেরকে সাজা দিয়েছিল সাদার ক্রাউন কোর্টে। Among the conspirators, যে ষড়যন্ত্রকারীদের মধ্যে আরেকজন ছিল was a former nightclub, toiletries, cellar company directors and a news agent. যে টয়লেট্রিজ দ্য নাইট ক্লাবের যে ডাইরেক্টররা, টয়লেট্রিজ সেল করার যে কোম্পানি ছিল একটা, ওই ডাইরেক্টর এবং নিউজ এজেন্ট সব আরেকজন মালিক, তাদেরকেও ওই ফ্রডের মধ্যে চার্জ করা হয়েছিল। তারা what sentences were given to these people?
Well, the sentences which were imposed were significant because the fraud was serious and it related to public bodies. And when the judge was considering how to deal with the people once they were convicted, he had to look at the fact that the fraud involved these public bodies, public money, which came from taxes, and therefore had a direct impact on members of the public. And of course, in respect of the NHS trusts, for example, potentially diverting funds that could have been used for the good of the public, for the health of the public, which we can see is very important, and obviously illustrated at the moment as being very important when we're in the middle of the pandemic. So the fraud sentencing guidelines, when the judge looked at this case and considered where it fell, meant that those that were at the top of the fraud received significant custodial sentences, and what you would call the principals, so the main figures who were running the fraud, were received sentences of 10 years imprisonment, which is considerable period of time in custody. And those who were lesser down the scale would then receive slightly shorter sentences. And in reaching that decision, what the judge did was look at guidelines which were available to him to determine how he should pass sentence. So he would look at the values involved, but not just the values involved, the harm that was caused. And as I've said, diverting public funds and using publicly available information demonstrates how a high level of harm and how serious this was. And so that's why it was regarded so seriously. So the court would look at that, and the main principals involved would get the greatest sentence. And in this case, sentences range from 10 years, then you had some sentences at 5.5 years, right down to individuals who were not as involved and were minor players in this big fraud. They received shorter sentences of 12 months, and in some cases those sentences didn't actually lead to immediate imprisonment. They were suspended. So when dealing with this case, the court was able to use the whole range of potential sentences available to recognise what was serious, who was the main player, what did they do, did they bully other people into joining the frauds in order to achieve their aim.
Can you just Tara, can you just go into the shorter way, small section of this information that you are giving?
Of course. So in
bit
terms of the
slower, and then section by section, one by one.
So in terms of the sentencing guidelines, what the court did was they looked at who was at the top of this. The ones at the top who were involved in the high values, or the particular public body involved was vulnerable because it was an NHS trust or a university, they would have the greatest sentence because it was clear that they were the most vulnerable. Then the judge would work down the sentencing guidelines and look at the roles that other people played. So, for example, people received sentences of 5.5 years, then 4.5 years, and working down the scale. And those lesser sentences, still significant, but recognise that the individuals involved were not at the top of the fraud, were perhaps not doing as much, perhaps not necessarily involved in every element of it, or perhaps didn't bully other people into doing things, then they would receive a lesser sentence. Right down to the smaller sentences where people were, for example, receiving 12 months imprisonment suspended, or 15 months imprisonment suspended, or 21 months imprisonment suspended. And what that means, what those sentences tell us, is that those individuals were at the bottom of this fraud, and they may have been bullied into doing this, and the court would recognise that perhaps they were forced, or their accounts were used in a very limited way, or it was only a small amount of money. Because whilst this is described as a £12 million fraud, that's the overall picture. So looking back, the overall scene of what happened. When a court is passing sentence, they consider each individual role and what did you do. And when, as I've mentioned, there are these things called fraud sentencing guidelines, the judge would look at an individual's behaviour and say, where does this fit? Have they done this before? Are they somebody that is a risk? And therefore the judge will determine what type of sentence. Have they benefited personally from the money that was been taken, or have they just received a small amount for their bank account to be used? All these various different elements are considered when determining where the sentences fall. And you can really see that process in this particular case, because 10 years is the most significant, right down to suspended sentences. And in respect of the Guernsey fraud, there were only 2 individuals who were identified and prosecuted in respect of that as part of this case. And they received sentences which totalled 11 years, again, reflecting what the individuals did and the role that they played. But it was quite clear that they weren't at the top of the tree, because otherwise they would have received higher sentences. And in terms of the roles that these people did, as you mentioned, some of these people were news agents, some of them were company directors. There were all sorts of different people with all sorts of different backgrounds who'd got drawn into this fraud. Some of them clearly will have been sophisticated individuals themselves in terms of their criminal behaviour, others clearly not. But nonetheless, because of how a conspiracy works, if they got involved and they knew they were involved, they then are, and the court convicts them or they plead guilty, they then are liable to be sentenced, even if they've never been in trouble before. And of course, that reiterates the point that you made throughout, that it's really important if you're ever arrested for any of these types of offences, even if you're right at the bottom, that you have legal representation, because these can be complicated situations. And these sentences which have been imposed demonstrate the need for having assistance from lawyers so that you can ensure that you're in the best position possible to fight this if you want to do it, or to understand the extent of your role and to communicate and to ensure that your positions are protected.
Yeah. দর্শক, ক্রাউন কোর্ট জাজ শাস্তি দিয়েছিল এদের সবাইকে, অনেকজনকে শাস্তি দিয়েছিল 23শে জুন 2017 সালে। যে একজন 47 বছর বয়স্ক সাদার লন্ডনের, তাকে 10 বছরের সাজা দিয়েছিল, প্রিজন সেন্টেন্স 10 বছরের জন্য। তাকে সাজা দিয়েছিল কনস্পিরেসি টু ডিফ্রড, যে ফ্রডের জন্য, কনস্পিরেসি ষড়যন্ত্র করছে, এন্ড কনস্পিরেসি টু মানি লন্ডার, তার মানে অর্থ পাচারের জন্য, এবং এগুলোর জন্য তাকে 10 বছরের সাজা দিয়েছিল। আরেকজন 53 বছর বয়স, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল আপনার, সে দুবাই থেকে আসছে, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 40 মাসের সাজা। আরেকজন হচ্ছে আপনার 44 বছর, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল আপনার 54 মাসের, 54 মান্থস। একজন 36 বছরের, সে উরচেস্টারশায়ারের, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 67 মান্থস প্রিজন। তারপরে 33 ইয়ার্সের একজন, তাকে, সে আসছিল রেডিচ থেকে, রেডিচের, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 67 বছর, 67 ইয়ার্স। 42 বছর বয়স্ক যে ল্যাঙ্কাশায়ারের, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 12 মাসের সাসপেন্ডেড ফর 2 ইয়ার্স ফর লন্ডারিং। তারপরে আরেকজন হলো আপনার 46 বছর বয়স্ক সারের, এবং তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 15 মাসের সাজা, সাসপেন্ডেড ফর 2 ইয়ার্স ফর মানি লন্ডারিং। 46 বছর সারের। আরেকজন হচ্ছে 48 বছর বয়স্ক, গ্লাসগো থেকে আসছে সে, তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 21 মাস এবং সাসপেন্ডেড, যেটাকে স্থগিত করা হয়েছিল 2 বছরের জন্য। আরেকজন 68 বছর রেডিচের, তাকে 22 সপ্তাহ 22 উইকস দেওয়া হয়েছিল এবং সাসপেন্ডেড ফর 2 ইয়ার্স। আরেকজন 35 বছর বয়স, এবং তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 8 মাস, এবং তাকে রিপে করতে বলা হয়েছিল 20,000 পাউন্ড, তুমি পে ব্যাক করো লিঙ্কনশায়ার NHS ট্রাস্টকে। এবং সে হইল কি, সে অ্যাডমিট করছে যে পারভার্টিং দ্য কোর্টস অফ জাস্টিস বাই সাপ্লাইং ফলস ডকুমেন্টস টু পুলিশ, তাকে এটা দেওয়া হয়েছিল। তার কারণটা ছিল কি, সে বিচার কার্য, ন্যায় বিচারকে প্রতিরোধ করার জন্য আপনার হেল্প করছিল, ওই যে সাপ্লাই করে, মানে ফলস ডকুমেন্ট সাপ্লাই করছিল আপনার, এগুলোর জন্য তাকে দেওয়া হয়েছিল 35 বছর বয়স্ক, 8 মাসের, এবং বলা হয়েছিল 20,000 পাউন্ড পে ব্যাক করার জন্য NHS ট্রাস্টকে। I would come back to you this question, what happened to Guernsey government, and we will then come back to the another one also, Lincolnshire Partnership NHS Foundation Trust.
So in respect of Guernsey government, a fraudster took advantage of the fact that Guernsey government were building a new airport runway, and the whole contract was worth £56 million. What happened in their case was that
56 million pounds.
56 million pounds was the price of the whole contract, and clearly that amount of money attracted fraudsters, and they found out information about who was undertaking that contract work for the Jersey government, and they discovered that it was a company called Langan Construction. That information, who was running the construction project, how much money each month that company was being paid by the Guernsey government, was information that was freely available to the public, mainly because it was such a large public project, and mainly because, as with any large public project involving the spending of public money, there has to be transparency. The government has to demonstrate that they have awarded contracts fairly and that there is public scrutiny. The downside of that is, in this case, it enabled somebody to find that information out and devise a mechanism of diverting funds from the legitimate company to the fraudster. And in this case, in June of 2012, very simply, a person rang up the Treasury Department of the Guernsey Government, and pretended to be somebody from Langan Construction with authority to make that telephone call, and asked if they could change the bank details because they'd updated their bank account. And that went through a process at the Guernsey Government, and a person in charge of security agreed that could happen. And so on the 3rd of July 2012, £2,613,032 was transferred and deposited into the fraudster's account. Of course, that was not an account belonging to Langan Construction. That was an account belonging to Sports Currency Management Limited, or pretending to be part of Sports Currency Management Limited. It was a false account. That account had been created in a particular way to fool the banking authorities into thinking that monies coming into that account were legitimate and monies being transferred out of that account were legitimate. And in this case, the money was transferred out before Langan realised that they had been conned, and it was transferred to a group in the United Arab Emirates, and then transferred again, partly through Abu Dhabi and partly through Istanbul. Now, in this particular instance, it wasn't Langan Construction who raised the concern, but it was the Royal Bank of Scotland. Because the Royal Bank of Scotland were concerned why such large amounts had come into this account and they were being transferred to Dubai. And in this particular instance, the fraudsters had pretended that they were buying racehorses in that part of the world. Racehorses are traded in Dubai. It being therefore not necessarily something unusual, racehorses can be extremely expensive. And so in that particular fraud, it was caught out because Bank of Scotland weren't content with that explanation, didn't think it ran true, and the fraud was discovered. But unfortunately, and this also demonstrates how these frauds work, is the money's moved very quickly. So even though there were alerts in that case, the money had already been transferred and has not been recovered in that particular case. And really, it demonstrates that those who were running the bank accounts, physically taking the money or physically accepting the money and then transferring it on, are actually taking the biggest risks. And in this case, they weren't the principal people involved, because the principal people involved were right at the other end, who were well and truly hidden, and eventually ended up with all of that money. Whereas those who were involved with the accounts, so Sports Currency Management Limited account, and then a person who was facilitating the transfer of money thereon, they're the people who were prosecuted and ended up receiving lengthy custodial sentences. And the two individuals in that case received a sentence in total of 11 years at Southwark Crown Court. So in that case, pretty serious for those, but they were by no means the principals in that particular element of that fraud.
We will come back to the Lincolnshire NHS Trust in a minute. Darshak, the Guernsey Government যে তাদেরকে defrauded করা হয়েছিল, the largest single amount of 2.6 million. এই যে ব্রিটিশ ডিপেন্ডেন্সি টেরিটরি, এটা একটা আইল্যান্ড, ব্রিটিশের নিয়ন্ত্রণাধীন ডিপেন্ডেন্সি টেরিটরি, যেটাকে আমরা বলি ব্রিটিশের একটা আইল্যান্ড, ব্রিটিশ সরকারের এই আপনার অধীনে। তাদেরকে এটা হইল লার্জেস্ট সিঙ্গেল অ্যামাউন্ট 2.6 মিলিয়ন পাউন্ডের ফ্রড করা হয়েছিল। and the cash funneled into 7 separate accounts, এবং যে ক্যাশগুলো সেটা 7টা ব্যাংক অ্যাকাউন্টের মধ্যে মুভ করা হয়েছিল। funneled into 7 separate accounts মানে 7টা ব্যাংক অ্যাকাউন্টের মধ্যে আপনার করা হয়েছিল এই পয়সাগুলো মুভ করা হয়েছে Lincolnshire Partnership NHS Foundation Trust lost 1.28 million এটা হলো আরেকটা NHS Foundation Trust যে Lincolnshire তাদের যেটা লস করেছে তারা হলো 1.28 million pound লস করেছে which was laundered through 8 separate bank accounts যেটা laundered করা হয়েছিল 8টা ব্যাংক অ্যাকাউন্টের মাধ্যমে so quite a large amount Guernsey Government and Lincolnshire NHS Trust 1.828 million এবং 2.6 million do you want to say anything about the Lincolnshire Partnership Trust Foundation target?
Well, in respect of the Lincolnshire Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, that's an example of how fraudsters target vulnerable public bodies where the cash is clearly come from taxation and is supposed to be used to provide important services for the public. Now, in that particular case, again, a very clever fraud, the Lincolnshire Partnership were building or developing a new mental health building. In addition to that, they were also developing and improving learning disability services and drug and alcohol treatment programs. Extremely important public services, much needed in Lincolnshire. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got the funding for them or the approval. And there, the fraudsters, in posing as the legitimate construction company, which was entitled to receive regular payments for the work that it was undertaken, the fraudsters wrote a letter, which was completely false, obviously, indicating that the payment details had changed. And now, rather than the original bank account, it should be a new bank account. And of course, that was a bank account controlled by the fraudsters. The money comes into that account and then it's diverted through a number of other accounts, I think 7 in total for this case, or this element of the case. And that is so that the money can be dispersed with a view to making it become legitimate, which is what money laundering is all about. The name money laundering comes from the concept that the money is being cleaned and being made to look legitimate. And here, what you had is an NHS trust, which is required as part of its obligations of better management and public scrutiny to have all of these details about its building projects and the services that it's planning to provide made public, including the funding, how the funding's structured, and who it is that obtains the contracts to provide building works. And that information, which needs to be in the public domain so the public can scrutinise and can raise any concerns or issues, and that there is no perception of money being misspent, is then stolen or taken advantage of by these fraudsters who were able to divert much needed public funds for their own purposes. And really, it's an example of these diversion frauds in place.
We will continue on this case in the next program again. We haven't finished it yet. I think we are out of time today. We don't have much time. দর্শক, আজ আমাদের সময় প্রায় শেষ হয়ে গেছে। আজকের এই প্রোগ্রামটি আবার রিপিট দেখানো হবে, পুনঃপ্রচার করা হবে আগামী মঙ্গলবার দিন দুপুর 12:30 থেকে 2টা। তাছাড়া এনটিভি ইউরোপের ফেসবুক এবং ইউটিউবে লগ ইন করলেও আপনারা এই প্রোগ্রামের দেখার সুযোগ পাবেন। এই আজম অথবা আজাম কো সলিসিটার্স এই নামে গুগল সার্চ করলে আপনারা এই প্রোগ্রামের লিংক পাওয়া যাবেন। আপনারা দেখতে পারবেন এই ইম্পর্টেন্ট আজকের এই প্রোগ্রামটা খুব বড় ধরনের ফ্রড এবং অনেককে পানিশমেন্ট দিয়েছে, লং প্রিজন সেন্টেন্স দিয়েছে, 10 বছরের পর্যন্ত সর্বোচ্চ সাজা দিয়েছে এবং পুরা নেশন ওয়াইড ইউকে ওয়াইড স্ক্যাম যেটা বলে, এটা কেলেঙ্কারি, অর্থ কেলেঙ্কারি। এখানে ফ্রড করা হয়েছে বিভিন্ন সরকারকে, গুয়ার্নজি গভর্নমেন্ট এবং বিভিন্ন এনএইচএস হসপিটালকে, ইউনিভার্সিটি প্রতিষ্ঠানকে। সুতরাং আপনারা এই প্রোগ্রামটা দেখার চেষ্টা করবেন সবাই। এই কেসের উপর আমরা আবার নেক্সট প্রোগ্রামে আমরা আবার ডিসকাস করবো আরো মোর ডিটেলস। সবাই ভালো থাকুন, সুস্থ থাকুন এবং সকলের প্রতি আমার শুভকামনা থাকলো। আসসালামু আলাইকুম।